Let's see here. Yep, so August break, welcome back. We just had a little update from everyone. I wanted to give everyone a butterfly service project update. Our revised application is due by next Friday. So Wendy, I have an email out to you. I think I should be able to get the stuff from the former application all ready to go and in so we can be considered at this month's funding meeting. I did attend last month's funding meeting, and it ranged from very polished presentations to people basically saying our project is great and will do a lot of good, and everything was approved. So I think we will do just fine, just have to get the application revised. And then just to remind everyone, we're sort of planning the project here this fall, implementing this winter, and all ready to kind of get it going before the growing season next year. So very exciting.
John, can I interject something?
Please
I got
do.
this in the mail, and it's a packet of seeds, and it says, "Be the change you want to see in the world." And I just wanted to show this to the club. I don't remember where I got this or why, but then, so I thought this was kind of cute. Maybe something that we could help.
I really, really like it. So let's get our small committee together, and I'll just put an invite out to anyone else who's interested in attending. I think I told the group I put these zinnia, seeds in my garden this year, and the dumb things are about 4 feet high. They're gorgeous and beautiful, and took nothing to plant, and it was fun to see them come up. So thanks for showing us that. In-person gathering. So a reminder that we have the fall color train ride and lunch on October 9th coming up. And let's see, I'm going to unshare for a sec. If you have a ticket and know for sure that you're coming, if you can just raise your hand quickly, or if you're on audio, just say I am. One, I think
I am.
Sandy is going with a friend.
Yeah, okay, great, sounds good.
And I've invited one other couple to join if they can, that might be interested in our club.
Sounds good. Okay, wonderful. So I think 6, I think a few more had indicated over email that they were going. So if you are still planning on going, just a reminder to get your tickets for the event as these things fill up. It's a very popular train ride. And I found this lovely image online, and I think this summarizes what we will see on October 9th. All right. And for everyone's info, we welcome new members. We have this goal of 25 new members by the end of the year. Our dues are rock bottom at $270 a year. We would love for just everyone on the call to kind of think about anyone in their life that would like to be a part of our small gathering of friends once a week and learn about some really interesting things in the world. And if you're not a member, please consider being one. And if you are a member already, or for people in your lives who are Rotary members, we have friends of our e-club. So this is a $100 donation each year. And then just, we invite you to join us for any meetings, anytime. So as if you're a member, but you can, maintain your formal membership in another club. So next week's speaker, Tanya Novak, the Tiger Sanctuary in Minneapolis. Chrisanne, have you been in contact with Tanya, and can you just say a few quick words about that? I didn't even know there was a Tiger Sanctuary. Who knew?
I know. So Tanya was an outbound to Brazil in the 70s or 80s. I think 70s. I think she went with staff. Anyway, she's an elementary school teacher, and she's interested in joining our club as well. She planted a garden for the children of her elementary school. I think it's on the school property or across the street from the school property. And it's a place for kids, really kind of a respite. And so she's kind of famous in her little neighborhood for doing this. There's actually a little video of her. I think it was at Star Tribune. It was somewhere. It all came to me and it was like, Tanya, you're famous. So she's going to come speak to us about her garden. I think it'll go hand in hand with our butterfly project as well. I think it's going to be really nice to hear from her next week.
So it's a flower sanctuary and not, what's the tiger have to do with it? I'm confused.
She has, I know. I think she calls it tiger because she has a little figurine of a tiger in it.
Got it. Yes, I was. And in fact, I just like switched over to our list of speakers. I'm like, oh my gosh, did I copy that down incorrectly? Because wasn't there a wild cat sanctuary up in Blaine? You know, I don't know if that's still, I thought it was an actual tiger sanctuary. Well, we have a really nice presentation next week and we'll look forward to it. Thanks for that info. And without further ado, today's speaker, Gregg White, on visiting the sites of the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. And before I hand it off, I'll just say that my dad grew up in Leesura, Minnesota, and one of his brothers and one of his sisters both lived in St. Peter, which is one of the sites of one of these memorial, interpretive centers on the conflict. And I kind of remember as a very young kid walking through this historical site. And so it's, I think it's something that's sort of right under our noses that, people on 169 going north and south drive by probably many of the sites all the time and don't really either know they're there or stop to learn about them. So I'm personally, Gregg, really interested in your presentation today, and turn it over to you here. And you're on. And you're on mute. And you're still on mute.
John, can you unmute me? I can't find myself.
You're unmuted now.
Thank you.
Oh, now you're here. Let me. There you go. You should be good now.
Okay, can people see the screen that I'm trying to share with you? So I'll just do it very, very quickly. If you look at the Mississippi River in the middle of this map, everything to the left did not come to the United States as part of the War of 1776, but to the right did. And in that kind of golden thing there, you see the Northwest Territory. What happened was that part of the in French and Indian War, which took place about 10 years before the Revolution, the Indians in the northern New York and southern Canada were armed with metal rifles, etc. And the Indians who are out in the plains, or at least in the Northwest Territory, were not. The Indians were forced. I'm going to say Indians throughout this presentation. We could also say Native Americans. We could also say First Nations. It's a lot of different terms. I'll use the Indian term. The Indians who were armed with rifles were forced to the west by the white settlers coming in as part of the American settlement. Those Indians included what we know that as the Chippewa or the Ojibwe. They came into contact with what were then woodland Dakotas, but the Dakotas did not have rifles, did not have metal, and the Chippewa did. So the Chippewa forced the Dakota out of the woods and onto the plains. And this became a source of large tension, obviously. And just about the time all this was happening, the Northwest Territory was split into the Wisconsin Territory, the Ohio Territory, etc. The Indians, first of all, let me just say this. Those of you who were not born and raised in Minnesota, some of this may be brand new information. Hopefully, those of you who went to grade school in Minnesota remember your 6th grade Minnesota history section. Maybe some of you do, and maybe some of you don't. But if you were in Minnesota for 6th grade, you were required to have a presented to you a Minnesota history thing, a section of Minnesota history. We in Minnesota think of the Ojibwe and the Dakota Indians. In Kirk and others in Wisconsin, we'll think of the Fox and the Cochunk and the Menominee and other tribes that were lived in Wisconsin. When the Ojibwe came from the east and started settling in northern Wisconsin, and the Fox and the Ho-Chunk Indians were not particularly happy with them. There are a lot of battles between them, and finally the Ojibwe were forced onto Madeline Island, and only Madeline Island. Their population expanded, and as they expanded, they fought their way out into northern Minnesota and forced the Dakota out. The Dakota then ceased to be, and at the Battle of I-80, by the way, you've heard of the Izades report at resort at the southern end of Lakes Mille Lacs. That was a Dakota village. I-80 was a Dakota village and was attacked and ransacked by the Ojibwe. And that was the last time that the Dakota lived in the woods and they were forced onto the plains. So by the time when Minnesota became a territory in 1853, as I recall, the Dakota were already highly stressed from having to change their entire way of living and started living in southern Minnesota on the plains. The places we're going to, this talk is mostly about the sites relating to the US-Dakota War, not to the Dakota War itself. I have obviously my opinions on what the war was like, and should it have been fought and should it not have been fought, et cetera. But I'm really going to talk about the sites that we can visit. As John said in his introduction, there are sites all over Minnesota, especially southern Minnesota, relating to the Dakota Indians and to this particular war. And I can tell you from having visited many of them, I think I've visited 24 in the past, over the past summer. At almost every single site I went to, I was either the only person there or maybe one other person there. So we the rest of Minnesota, the non-Dakota portion of Minnesota, don't necessarily go to these sites and realize what's going on. The sites on this particular map that are indicated in red, either in a triangle or a dot, are operated by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and are either state parks or state waysides. John, who has a cabin up in Hovland, Minnesota, can attest that there, I think, are 5 Minnesota state waysides just on the north shore of Lake Superior. To qualify for a state wayside, the site either has to have a remarkable view that would otherwise be lost to the public, or has to have a remarkable historic site that would otherwise be lost to the public. And they're too small for the Minnesota historic sites owned by the Minnesota Historical Society to be taken over. So therefore they're turned into waysides, a sign or two are put up, and it's up to the individual to do their own interpretation. I have underlined every place that I visited, and I visited a lot more, but every place I visited in the past 6 months, if the places in black, the names in black are obviously are operated Minnesota State Parks, part of the Department of Natural Resources, and the sites in blue are operated by the Minnesota Historical Society, or at least owned by the Minnesota Historical Society. In the past decade, as part of cost saving and to localization, many of the sites operated by the Minnesota Historical Society have actually been turned over to the local County Historical Society to staff. This would include the Sibley House, Traverse de Sioux, which John talked about in St. Peter. It used to be a historic site run by the Historical Society, and is now operated by the Nicollet County Historical Society, etc. Other sites are operated by the local Sioux reservation. Now, sometimes places they call themselves Sioux, in some places they call themselves Dakota. It's the same people. It depends upon history why they call themselves Dakota and why they call themselves Sioux. Other monuments raised around the turn of the century, I'm talking about late 1800s and early 1900s, were raised by the Minnesota Valley Historical Society. And unbeknownst to me until I just did research on this, there were something like 29 sites raised in Minnesota by the Minnesota legislature. And we can see these as we go along. From now on, I'm going to talk in a chronological order. In September 23, 1805, Zebulon Pike negotiated a treaty with the Dakota Indians who lived at what we now call Mendota cede some land to him so he could build a fort at Fort Snelling. As you can see, I think my cursor is visible. Fort Snelling is over here. Over here's the Mississippi, here's the Minnesota, and here's Mendota. And in between is Pike Island. The Dakota say as part of their origin story that they originate at this site, and the earth is carried on the back of a turtle, and the Dakota people were born on Pike Island. To this day, if you go to Pike Island, you can see often Dakota down in that area, perhaps celebrating in ways that we as non-Dakotas don't quite understand, but they go forward with that. It's interesting that they ceded this land to the white settlers. And notice this date, 1805. This is just 1 year after the west side of the Mississippi was purchased by the United States from France. So if you look to your right at the very top of this, where it says the falls of somebody up here, this came to the United States as part of the War of 1776. But here, Fort Snelling came to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase just 1 year before. The British were certainly eager to take over the French territories here and have their own hegemony at this part of the area. So Zebulon Pike felt it was essential to build Fort Snelling, both to say as the farthest north fort and the farthest west fort at that time of the United States, and saying to the British, keep the heck out, and to the French, keep the heck out, even though we just purchased land from the French. And he wanted to have a fort here to separate the Dakota from the Ojibwe because they were warring. And for the most part, this took place. And by the way, those of you who live in the Twin Cities, you might have read that Pilot Knob was recently returned to the Dakota Indian from Dakota County. That's this area here. This is Pilot Knob, 100 feet high above it. So Fort Snelling puts American hegemony on the western frontier, both for the Indians and for the British. Nowadays, whoops, I went a little too far. Nowadays, this area is celebrated and memorialized and visited, is able for us to visit at Fort Snelling State Park, not the historic site, but the state park, which is down at the river bottoms. The park is very, very well visited, although I think very few people who visit the park realize that there is just to the right of this visitor center is a large monument to the Dakota people who lived here beforehand, and that their origin stories begins right here. Great place to visit. By the way, the Fort Snelling State Park, one of the neat things they do is on New Year's Eve, they put out about 10,000 luminaries or luminaria, depending upon your plural, and you can take either a 3 or 5 mile hike through the park. I've seen the traffic backed up for miles to get in for this. Many, many people visit. It's a great thing to see. Again, in 1805, 1 year after the United States purchased the Louisiana Purchase, a Quebecer, Jean-Baptiste Faribault, after whom the town of Faribault is not named, he is named agent to the Dakota people from the Northwest Company. The Northwest Company was based in Montreal, is a French fur company or a French Canadian fur company, not having to do with the United States. And he moved to what's now near, he lived with the Dakota people and he lived near what's now called Carver, but eventually moves to Mendota, and this is his house in Mendota. He moved to Fort Snelling when he was 15 years old. Imagine this, his parents let him leave Quebec. He moved to Fort Snelling when he was 15 as a French speaker, and he learned both English and fluent Dakota. He's one of the few Westerners who learned fluent Dakota and was very well trusted by the Dakota people. I'm going to see if I can do this. There. No offense to you. There. Not far from him, a Yankee, and when I say a Yankee, I mean a person from New England or upstate New York, named Henry Sibling, was named to the head of the American Fur Company, Dakota Unit. The American Fur Company was a competitor, direct competitor with the Northwest Fur Company, and Sibley started out as a competitor to Faribault, but eventually Faribault realized that the Americans were going to win the fur trade war. Also, the furs became much less popular, and the Dakota people and other Indians had to find another way to make money. He built his headquarters, Sibley, in Mendota, Minnesota, and he went on from being not only the head of the American Fur Company Dakota unit, but also became the first territorial governor of the state of Minnesota and became the colonel in charge of the forces who fought the Dakota in the Dakota War. Mendota was the most important civilian point in Minnesota until the establishment of St. Paul, which was then called Pig's Eye. By the way, if you go back to the treaty of Pike's Treaty in this part of the territory, you'll notice that the Fort Snelling and Mendota are on the west side of the river, i.e. part of the Louisiana Purchase. But we, the white people who represented the United States, told the Indians we would only build on the east side of the Mississippi. So hence, if you go today, even though Fort Snelling is to anybody's eyes, it's on the west side of the Mississippi, we claimed it was on the eastern side. And to this day, Fort Snelling and the Fort Snelling Military Reservation, which includes Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, they all have St. Paul zip codes, not Minneapolis zip codes, reflecting the fact that they lie on the east side, not of the Mississippi River. In 1851, July 23rd, only a few months before the territory becomes the territory of Minnesota, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux is signed in just north of St. Peter. Again, the site was built by the Historical Society of Minnesota, but now is operated by the Nicollet Historical Society. Very interesting place to visit. I've been there multiple times, although I've gone there mostly to look up what's going on with Swedish settlers to north of St. Peter, but they also talk about what's going on here. Now, at the Traverse des Sioux, we really don't know exactly where the traverse is. In this case, the traverse is a rapids. It's a place shallow enough to walk across the Minnesota River. You don't have to build a bridge. You don't have to have a canoe. It's been used by what they claim thousands of years by Dakota. I might question that because I'm not sure the people 2,000 years ago called themselves Dakota, but they certainly were Native Americans of some form or another. And this area has been used for many, many years by Dakota people. Not long thereafter, 2 months later, or 2 weeks later, whatever, the Treaty of Mendota was signed with the lower bands. Notice that the Traverse des Sioux is signed with the upper bands, the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of Dakota, and the lower bands, the Minnewatecan, who now has Mystic Lake, and Wapakute also signed a treaty. And between these treaties, they ceded the following lands. The lands are the green portion of the map in front of you. All these lands were occupied by the Dakota, not by the Ojibwe. Notice that the Ojibwe and Lake Mille Lacs are farther north. And what they ceded to the United States was the land on the upper reaches of the Minnesota River, 5 miles to the north and 5 miles to the south of the river. And it was thought by the Dakota that these lands had the thickest woods and the most animals, i.e. deer and whatever that they hunted, and they could live actually rather successfully in this area. We forget how few Dakota there were at this time. There were maybe 2,000 to maybe 3,000 total Eastern Dakota in Minnesota. Not many people. More likely 2,000, in fact, even a little bit fewer than 2,000 people. That's an awfully few people to occupy that very, very large territory in Minnesota. But if you're hunting, you need all that territory. You need to find the deer, you need to find the fish, you need to find the beaver, et cetera. And of course, with all the streams entering the Minnesota River, one had the ability to have capture those small rodents for furs and sell them to the white people. The problem is that the Westerners, with the fur market collapsing, the Dakota didn't have much to sell. I'm sorry. In January of 1862, just as the Civil War is beginning, Lincoln is warned by the Lower Sioux agent that the abuses that the Westerners or the United States was visiting upon the Dakota Indians could lead to war. Lincoln did not heed this war message. In the summer of 1862, in this very building right in front of you, and you can visit the building yourself. Very few people do, and notice the bars over the windows. A new Dakota agent came into being. He was considered, even by today's, or now with today's standards, he was considered to be mentally unstable. Among many things, he really disliked the Dakota or any other Indians. And while the United States had promised much food to the Dakota Indians and much money to the Dakota Indians, unfortunately, the agent, would not let the money, or either the money or the food go. And he replied, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass." The Dakota people were starving. The Dakota men approached this agent and said, "Just give us food for the women and children, we will starve." And he said, "No, let them eat grass." The other thing is that the payments to the Dakota people were negotiated away by the fur traders, because the Dakota people, after the collapse of the fur trade, continued to want to receive money. And the people, the traders who owned small stores and were called sutleries, along the Minnesota River, sold to the Dakota on credit. When the fur trade collapsed, Dakota could not pay back the credit. And so the monies that were earmarked for the Dakota people actually went to the fur traders. Now we go day by day. On August 17th, 1862, 4 young Dakota men killed 5 settlers near Acton, Minnesota, or Grove City in Meeker County. This is the monument that's been raised there at Acton for these 5 settlers. There's not a monument obviously raised for the Dakota men. What amazes me is how far this is away from the Minnesota River. I would consider this a 2-hour drive. And yet in one day, the Dakota people traveled by horse, and one day later attacked the Lower Sioux Agency, sometimes called the Redwood Agency, which was under the leadership of the Dakota, were under the leadership of Little Crow, Shakopee, there's your name, John, and others. The agency was attacked, and of course, unfortunately, the agent, by the way, was killed. And the guy who said, "Let them eat grass," and when they found his body, his mouth was stuffed with grass. Wonder why. Same day, the people at Fort Ridgely, not to be confused with Fort Ripley, but Fort Ridgely is just across the river from the Lower Sioux Agency. The United States Army sent a force, which was actually volunteers from the Minnesota 1st and 3rd Volunteers, were sent to relieve the Lower Sioux Agency, but they were ambushed when crossing at Redwood Ferry. 24 soldiers were killed, and no known Dakota were killed. Again, one can go and visit the site in Acton, the site here at the Lower Sioux Agency, and the site here at Redwood Ferry. If you stand at this monument and look down toward the Minnesota River, you can see exactly where the ferry was and where the soldiers tried to cross the river. Some of the soldiers were actually killed by the Sioux or the Dakota, and some of the soldiers drowned on the ferry crossing. On the next day at the Upper Sioux Agency, which is also known as the Yellow Medicine Agency, that agency is evacuated. This is one of about 24 stone buildings that existed on that site at that time. Some were lodges where people lived. This is a duplex. Some were storehouses. Some were military establishments, especially those that contained munitions. And some were just plain areas that belonged to the Native Americans. And at the Upper Sioux Agency, the agent, whose name was Brown, was actually rather successful at teaching agriculture to the Dakota people. And the whole territory around the Upper Sioux Agency became became very agricultural and not so much hunting. The Lower Sioux Indians never adopted the hunting or the agriculture like the Upper Sioux did, and they relied much more on hunting and on fishing, etc., and gathering. And of course, when the United States Senate halved, when I should go back, the United States Senate halved the reservation, everything north of the river. They said, no, we're going to take that. A rumor had spread among settlers coming into Minnesota that crops could only be grown on places that were informally inhabited by trees. Therefore, the prairie, that great, big, beautiful prairie, which we consider some of the richest farmland in the world, throughout Minnesota, at least in 1858, was considered unarable by the settlers who were coming to Minnesota, and they wanted only treed or tree-covered land. Therefore, they were given the area north of the Minnesota River to cut down trees and to start farming there.
Hey, Greg, can you go back to the map for a sec? When you
Sure.
talk about Upper and Lower Sioux Agency, are you talking about the area north and south, that red area north and south of the Minnesota River? Can you
So
point to it?
Sure. Can you see the two dots on that map? This is Lower Sioux Agency and this is Upper Sioux Agency.
What does an agency mean? Like an
Oh,
area? Is
Oh,
it a
no, I'm
governmental
sorry.
center?
An agency is the governmental center with an agent, therefore an agency, and that person represents the United States to the Native Americans, in this case, to the Dakotas. If the United States has agreed to send food or arms or payments to the people, that goes through the agent. To become an agent, an Indian agent in Minnesota meant almost guaranteed you were going to become very, very rich. Sibley was an agent at one point. He became very rich and became later on governor of the territory, and later after that, the governor of the state of Minnesota. Brown, who was the Upper Sioux agent, by the way, Sibley was agent down at Mendota. Brown, who was agent at the Upper Sioux Agency, he's the only other one whose name I know. He was very successful at converting the Dakota people from hunter-gatherers to agricultural landed people, while no agent at the Lower Sioux Agency ever was successful at that. By the way, if you've ever visited either reservation, the Upper Sioux Reservation or the Lower Sioux Reservation, those are fascinating places to go visit. Mind your P's and Q's. Absolutely, positively do not, Karin, have a lead foot in these areas. You're likely to be pulled over. I have no idea who might have a lead foot, but you don't want to be pulled over by tribal police for speeding through their agency. They don't like us. They don't like white people as it is going through their agency. But you nose around, you can really see some interesting things. I was last on the Lower Sioux Agency probably 12, 15 years ago, and the improvement that have made to the Lower Sioux Agency on the agency, on the reservation itself, are quite remarkable. The reservation looks much better today than it did 15 years ago. I'm impressed. I don't think it's just money that they've made from gambling. I think it's a real intended desire on behalf of the bands, the Lower Sioux Band and the Upper Sioux Band, to really clean up their act and have the reservations be much more presentable. And they also get a lot, they do get money from both the government and from gambling. Does that answer your question, John? Hearing nothing, now we'll go forward.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I was hitting my space bar, but it wasn't taking me up. Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Sure. Again, this is the agent. This is the storehouse, I'm sorry, at Lower Sioux Agency, which contained much food and a whole lot of money. And again, the fur traders took the money, and only the food eventually ended up with the Dakota, but they really got almost none of it. This is the Upper Sioux Agency. Again, this is a duplex, but there was a storehouse similar to what we saw. This is the Joseph R. Brown Wayside Memorial, or Memorial Wayside. This is on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. I am so surprised that the state of Minnesota even knows this place exists. There is not a state highway within 6 or 7 miles of here. This is a really crappy dirt road that is, like I say, out in the middle of nowhere, but it's oiled so you don't have dust just in the short area nearby here. Susan Brown, who was wife of the former Upper Sioux agent, Joseph Brown, he was on a trip to New York. He was an entrepreneur of many types. She abandoned her stone home. This was a 3-story stone house with a grand piano in the great parlor and a billiard room with a slate billiard table on the 3rd floor. This was a fancy house and a fancy farmstead. And she had 12 children and a whole bunch of servants. Now, we don't know if these servants were native or if these servants were white or if these servants were black. We don't know. But this was a pretty big farmstead, beautiful land. As you can see, it's timbered, but in those days they cleared the land, and this was a really successful farm. What's most interesting about Susan Brown is that she was half French and half Dakota. She was not American by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, she was a cousin to Little Crow, the chief of the Indians, the Lower Sioux Indians, who were fighting with the United States. Pretty interesting. All these people, they tried escaping, and they were taken, captured by Little Crow and his other people, and taken hostage. When Little Crow realized that his cousin Susan Brown, and she spoke Dakota much better than she spoke English, was one of the hostages, he gave his countenance to her and all of her entire party, and actually they lived rather well, including living in the Upper Sioux Agency storehouse for a while. One day later came the first attack in New Ulm. You probably can't see this very well, but this is on the base of the, we're going to see the entire monument in a while, base of the monument in New Ulm, and the Indians are attacking. You can see the house on the log cabin on the right burning, and the fallen horses, etc. On the first day, the Dakota did fairly well against the people of New Ulm, but then because of torrential rains, they backed off. Again, that's August 19th. On August 20th, so about 20 miles west of New Ulm, Lake Shetak settlement is attacked by the Dakota. The surviving women, children are taken hostage and are moved to Dakota Territory, what we now call South Dakota. There's a large monument not only at Lake Shetak, but also within Lake Shetak State Park. And this monument, you can see, I only went at the bottom here to show you when it was erected, 1924. There are a whole bunch of these monuments across Minnesota. I think the number is 29, and they all have the same obelisk shape. On one day later, on August 20th, 1862, came the first attack on Fort Ridgely. The Fort Ridgely was meant to be a training camp, mostly so the United States could train police officers or law enforcement officers as well as soldiers, and it was never meant to be meant to be defended, and the site is wide open. I do find it interesting that in one of the munitions buildings, which is located away from everything else, it's the only place I could find a lightning rod. Wouldn't you know it, Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod came all the way out here to Minnesota. And of course, lightning on the prairie happens. And if you have a lot of munitions, i.e. gunpowder in a munitions store, you better have a lightning rod. And they did on both of the storehouses. This is a pretty darn big fort. The only two houses that have been rebuilt have been this one in front of you. And the other one is the munitions store. But with these thick walls, granite walls, people with rifles who are attacking you could not really be very successful. It was difficult to defend, but shortly thereafter came the artillery under Colonel Sibley, and the artillery is the key role. Pretty hard to fight artillery if you only have soldiers. This is 2 days later, by the way, August 20th versus August 22nd. August 22nd. Come on, there. Stay. August 22nd. Notice again, there's this huge obelisk that's been raised. On the four sides of the obelisk, they list everybody who was killed, not everybody, all the soldiers and the white people who were killed. They list the officers who led the defense, etc. But not one mention is made of the Dakota, other than they did the attack. And the few Dakota who were killed here at Fort Ridgely were buried in an unmarked grave. A day later.
Hey, Greg,
yes, sir.
About 5 minutes, so we have time for questions.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're almost done, so be good. I'm happy with that. On August 23rd, the second attack takes place in New Ulm. 32 townspeople are killed, 60 are wounded, and the town is just evacuated, and they go to Mankato. Dakota, and August 23rd, 1862, Little Crow and his Dakota soldiers retreat to the Lower Sioux Agency after being unable to take New Ulm. There's the large obelisk that's in New Ulm. I showed you the detail from before. And then on September 2nd, and this is the most interesting place to visit, is the Birch Coulee battlefield. These were a burial party that was sent out to defend themselves, to bury people, and they were attacked and surprised by the lower Sioux Dakota, but the upper Sioux Dakota on the same day began talks with the white settlers. Little Crow and his soldiers retreat to the, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going down. This is a monument to Birch Coulee that was erected at the turn of the century that talks a lot about how the whites were massacred, but nothing about the Dakota who were killed, much less in any way. And anyway, they were destroyed or killed. Notice that 13 white soldiers were killed at Birch Coulee, and yet only 2 Dakota soldiers were killed. September 3rd to 5, he moves Little Crow moves the action to the north and to the west, into North Dakota, actually to the Fort Abercrombie. And finally, on September 23rd, the war comes to an end when Colonel Sibley and his troops defeat Little Crow at Wood Lake. Only 7 troops were killed at this, while at least twice as many Dakota were killed. It's interesting to me how small the numbers were. Once again, look in the background at the large obelisk. This is the obelisk in Montevideo, Minnesota, where the white and quote mixed blood prisoners were released to Sibley, and he promised only Dakota who killed settlers would be prosecuted, and 38 Indians were hanged on December 26th, day after Christmas, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota. Originally, 264 additional were scheduled to be hanged, but they were not because Bishop Wimple, who was the Anglican Bishop of Minnesota, traveled all the way to DC to plead for the clemency from Lincoln, which was granted. In the winter of 1862, 1,600 Dakota non-combatants, mostly women, children, and old people, were marched to Fort Snelling for their protection for fear that the settlers would take revenge upon them. 1/4 died before spring. The remainder are marched to the Dakota Territory. Oops, I'm sorry. And we could go visit the Fort Snelling site today, but it's closed right now because of revitalization will not be open until next year. And the final sites relating to the war is 77 United States volunteers, 27 Minnesota volunteers, and 359 civilians in Minnesota were killed. Approximately 150 Dakota soldiers were killed, and 38 were executed. But all Dakota Indians were expelled from Minnesota, and we had a bounty in Minnesota. I cannot believe this. We had a bounty in Minnesota of between $25 and $200 on Dakota scalps that were turned in the state of Minnesota. Pretty brutal times. Near the turn of the century, the Minnesota legislature erected 23 monuments, very similar to shape as this one in front of you, only one of which, and this one right in front of you, commemorates the Dakota, and this is called a monument to the friendly Dakota. And that's the end.
Well, to begin with, yeah, round of applause. Hi, Stephanie. Round of applause, really great presentation. I'm taken with a couple of things. One, the tragedy of it all. Two, how none of us really learned any of it. And 3, how on earth do you know all of this? I just kept thinking over and over again, have you been studying this for many years or?
Well, it's 6th grade, which I'm sure you did too, because you grew up in Shakopee, Minnesota.
Not a word.
I do have kind of a good memory. What amazes me, and again, the site is more about the presentation is more about the sites than about the war itself. There are so many sites that one can go visit, whether one is Dakota or one is, it's rainy like mad here. Whether one is of any descent, one can go visit these sites and learn stuff. The Birch Coulee site is by far the best. They take you on a tour around and you put your feet on these concrete footsteps in the ground. If you stand here and look that way, you can see a white stick, which you can, oh my goodness. And about 100 yards that away, there was Chief Little Crow, or 100 yards that away where the American soldiers or the Minnesota soldiers with Sibley, etc. It's just amazing what you can see. And all these sites are all across southern Minnesota. Pretty amazing deal. I did everything on this that you saw on day trips from my home. So I didn't have to spend a night in a hotel. Didn't have to pay for that. Yes, I had to fill up my car, which is what filling up cars, $34, $35 these days. But I thought I could go see a site and spend a half hour there and run off to the next site. No, these sites were so fascinating. I kept spending hours and hours looking at the locations. It's really interesting. The other thing, of course, is that taking these day trips then took me to the local town, Granite Falls or New Ulm or whatever, and I got to participate in the town, see what the town was like. I'd never been to Granite Falls before. I'd never been to Montevideo before. It's fascinating. By the way, Granite. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Go ahead. I
Granite
was just going to
Falls.
say, I'd love a copy of your presentation and maybe use it as a guide, to like trace over the chronology. I love how you presented it.
Well,
So if
thank
you're
you.
willing to share it with the group, please
Of course.
do send it.
Well, I think Kirk recorded it, but I will also send you the presentation as a PowerPoint if you like. I'll say about Granite Falls, I was there on a Saturday afternoon, probably 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a beautiful, 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 beautiful summer day. And there were perhaps 10 other people in the entire downtown.
Wow.
Just sad.
Any questions for Gregg? We're right at time. And I do want to say hi to Davidson, who's tuning in from Kenya, and looks like James is also joining us here. But
I
any
went to high
quick
school.
questions for Gregg?
I went to high school, by the way, James.
Hey, Greg.
Hey, Jimmy.
Questions? Karin, you usually have a question, and so I'm going to call him.
So my memory is so hazy and of Minnesota history. I'm ashamed to say, I'm terribly ashamed to say. Were there similar, what was going on in the Dakotas? What was going on in Wisconsin? I suppose Wisconsin less because Wisconsin was settled earlier, but what was going on in the Dakotas at that time?
To my knowledge, and according to my reading, and Kirk can kick in much better than I can, but I don't think there was any large conflict between the natives in Wisconsin and the white people moving in. Kirk, do you remember anything from 6th grade in Wisconsin?
I didn't grow up in Wisconsin, but
Oh, okay.
I think there were some conflicts on smaller scales, but I don't know that we have major conflicts. St. Croix Falls has a pretty rich history that included a lot of native historical documentation. I haven't plowed through it all, but this area here is connected to with the river particularly. There was actually trading posts and things that were run by natives in St. Croix Falls, and there was along the river a small settling of individuals who were mainly natives, and they ran some of the trading posts. There are reservations in Polk County that have long been there, but I don't know a lot of the history of that. So, and I want to say that that's the Ojibwe tribe.
I think it's Ho Chunk and Fox Indians in Wisconsin. I think, but I could be, no, it is Ojibwe. It is Ojibwe.
Yeah, I think it's the Ojibwe is
Yeah.
on the reservation in Polk County.
I think you're correct. Karin, to answer your question, there were only 2 major Northwestern, that is, I'm going to say, away from Mexico or the Mexican territory, which remember included New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado. There are only 2 major conflicts in the West. Both were with the Dakota or Lakota or Nakota. The one was here in Minnesota, and the other is sometimes called the Great Sioux War. And that's what we know as the Battle of Little Bighorn in Custer. So between here in Minnesota and Custer out there in Wyoming, I think it was, those are only the only 2 major conflicts. Now those are Western Dakota or Lakota, Nakota, and we deal only in Minnesota with the Eastern Dakota. And
because
when we
you said that the Dakota were driven out of Minnesota then.
100, supposedly 100%.
Okay, and so did they go to the Dakotas Where did they go?
The men were imprisoned, mostly in Iowa, and the women, children, and old people were sent to a reservation in the middle of South Dakota, someplace they'd never been before. But and by the way, I think of the 12 counties involved with this conflict, something like 8 of them lost 100% of their white population for 3 years. Pretty amazing. And the territory was completely abandoned. With time, the Minnesota Dakota, i.e. the Eastern Dakota, who were banished to South Dakota, migrated back slowly to the reservations, the upper and lower Sioux reservations along the Minnesota River, occupying mostly the south side of the river. And with time, the Minnesota legislature / the US Senate recognized the 2 reservations on the upper Sioux reservation, the lower Sioux reservation along the Minnesota River. And that's what
Greg, did you say that most of the white people left the county, or most of the
white settlers in terror left the counties? And the counties were, because the Dakota had been shipped to South Dakota and the white settlers were terrified to move back or afraid to move back, literally the counties had no population of humans at all for 2 or 3 years until the end of the Civil War.
Can I just take a quick break from questions? We're over time, but I do want to welcome Davidson from Kenya and just have him say a few quick words if you'd like to, Davidson.
Yes, thank you, Kirk, and fellow Rotarians. Hello, good evening. Hello. And good morning. Yes, my name is Davidson Ahonya. I'm right in the heart of Africa. This is Kenya in East Africa. Sorry, it is the early hours of a Thursday morning here. So it's dark all over here. My house does not have lighting, so you may not be able to see my face. It's dark all over. So I'm a member of the Rotary Club here of Bungoma, Elgon, Kenya. This region lies on the border of Kenya and Uganda. I've been the charter president. My term was about 3 years back when we began our club. And currently, I'm honored to serve my club in the capacity of a director for projects. So happy joining you, my fellow Rotarians.
Yes, thank you so much and welcome.
Okay, good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And James or Jimmy, would you like to also say hello? I don't know if you go by Jimmy or if that's just a name Greg likes to call you from yesteryear.
I would use Jim.
Yeah, no, he calls me Jimmy, so I'll call him Greggy too sometimes. But, it's a pleasure to be part of this evening, and I look forward to it. And thanks for letting me listen in. Looking forward to it.
Very good. Please do come and join us again. Greggy, I'll twist your arm. Thanks so much. So we are at time. I'm just going to go to the presentation here. We can say the Rotary four-way, the four-way test together, and then everyone can. I just have this feeling, although we like to end on time, and we normally do, that this is a really interesting topic for many of us. And Greg, if you're willing to stay around a few more minutes, I'd love to have some additional questions. So
I'd be happy to.
We end our meetings with the Rotary four-way test. So if everyone can take themselves off of mute, and of the things that we think, say, and do. Is it the truth?
Is it
fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
As long as we have ourselves off of mute, how about a round of applause for Greg? It's really been a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And feel free to stick around for some additional questions. Thanks for letting me interject there, make some intros. And Karen, did that answer your question about, what was going on? I also had the question, I was wondering about Wisconsin. What was going on during this time in Wisconsin? Thanks, Jane. Have a great night. See you next week.